So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Julianne Vance laughed as she emptied her champagne glass over Elena's dress in front of the entire gala. The pale gold liquid bloomed across the bodice of the vintage silk, cold and insulting. Around them, the hum of the Vance estate's ballroom died an instant death. The scent of 1,000 white lilies, cloying and heavy, seemed to thicken in the sudden silence. Julianne didn't look remorseful. She stood there, a vision in custom Dior, her diamond necklace catching the light of the crystal chandeliers with every breath. She tilted her head, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, Elena, I'm so sorry. I thought you were one of the servers. That dress." It's so easy to make that mistake, isn't it? Elena Vance didn't flinch. She didn't wipe the liquid away. She simply looked at her cousin, her gaze level and unnervingly calm. The moisture was a freezing weight against her skin, but she didn't give Julianne the satisfaction of a shiver. "It's an honest mistake," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Though I imagine the servers have better taste in vintage." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before her eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, invading Elena's space, the sharp click of her stilettos on the Carrara marble sounding like a countdown. "You shouldn't even be here," she whispered, low enough only for Elena to hear. "Grandfather gave you 5 years to disappear. Coming back for the anniversary gala isn't brave, it's pathetic. You're still the same little thief who nearly ruined this family." Across the room, Arthur Vance stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of retired judicial stone. He watched his granddaughters with a gaze that held no warmth, his hand gripping the silver head of his cane. Beside him, Sarah Vance leaned in, whispering something that made Julianne smirk. The socialites in the room, draped in silk and ego, began to whisper, their eyes darting between the two women. Julianne reached out, her manicured fingers plucking at the damp collar of Elena's dress. "Is this polyester?" "It must be. I can smell the desperation from here." She turned to the crowd, raising her voice so the witnesses could savor the kill. "Everyone, I think my cousin has had a bit too much to drink. Perhaps someone could show her to the service entrance. It's more her speed these days." A few of Julian's friends giggled behind their fans. The humiliation was calculated, a public stripping of what little dignity they thought Elena had left. Elena reached into her small, unassuming clutch. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of a digital recorder, already active and capturing every word. She also felt the weight of the heavy, wax-sealed envelope she'd received from Evelyn St. James earlier, that afternoon. Julianne thought she was the one in control because she held the champagne and the invitations. She had no idea the foundation of her world was already cracked. "I'm here because I was invited, Julianne," Elena said. "By who? The catering staff." Julianne laughed, the sound high and brittle. "I handle the guest list. Your name was never on it. You're an uninvited ghost, Elena, and ghosts should stay buried." Julianne turned her back on her cousin, a dismissal so complete it was meant to be the final word. She signaled a waiter, her movements fluid and practiced. "Clean this up," she commanded, gesturing vaguely at the floor where a few drops of champagne had landed. "And see that my cousin finds her way to the street. She's distressing the guests." Elena watched the waiter approach, a young man who looked caught between a rock and a hard place. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, then turned her attention back to the woman who had spent the last 5 years living in the room that should have been hers. "You're right about one thing, Julianne," Elena said, loud enough to stop her cousin in her tracks. "The guest list is important, which is why I'm surprised you haven't noticed who's missing tonight." Julianne stopped and turned, her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Detective Miller," Elena replied. The name was a small stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples immediate. Julian's posture stiffened. "He called me this morning. He seemed very interested in the Vance family accounts, specifically the ones you've been managing since I was sent away." Julian's face paled for a heartbeat before she forced a laugh. "Miller, that old dog, he's been retired for years. You're hallucinating." "He's back on special assignment," Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold, precise whisper as she stepped toward her cousin. "And I'm the one who gave him the keys to the vault." The arrogance in Julian's eyes flickered, replaced by a flash of genuine, jagged fear. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, masked by a sneer, but Elena had seen it. The trap was set, and Julian had just walked right into the center of it. "You're lying," Julian hissed, her voice trembling slightly. "You have nothing. You're a disgraced architect with a ruined reputation. No one believes a word you say." "We'll see," Elena said. She looked past Julian to Arthur, who was now moving toward them, his cane thumping rhythmically against the floor. "Grandfather looks like he wants a word. I'd suggest you find a way to explain the missing $3 million from the foundation before he reaches us." Julian spun around, her eyes darting to Arthur. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers tangling in her diamonds. Elena didn't wait for the confrontation. She turned and walked toward the grand staircase, her head held high, the damp silk of her dress a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. She had 2 days until the board meeting. 2 days to let the poison of doubt do its work. As she reached the landing, she looked down at the glittering, hollow world she had once called home. The game hadn't just begun. It was already over. Julian just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the air in Elena's small studio felt heavy with the scent of rain and old ink. She didn't have the luxury of the Vance mansion's climate control anymore, but the draftiness kept her sharp. Her phone vibrated against the wooden desk, the screen illuminating a message from an unknown number. It was a digital copy of a legal injunction. Julianne Vance had wasted no time. She was filing for a restraining order, citing Elena's erratic and threatening behavior at the gala. Elena Vance set the phone down. Her hand didn't shake. She had expected the wounded wolf to snap, but her sister was moving faster than anticipated. Julian was trying to scrub Elena from the family's social fabric before the board meeting could even convene. 2 hours later, Elena stood in the hushed, velvet-lined sanctuary of St. James Fine Jewels. The shop smelled of expensive polishing compound and Earl Grey tea. Evelyn St. James looked up from a display case, her sharp eyes softening as she saw the younger woman. "You look like you haven't slept," Evelyn said, her voice a soothing rasp. She didn't offer a hug. She offered a heavy, iron-gray USB drive. "But I suppose you won't need sleep once you see what's on here." "Is it the ledger?" Elena asked, her voice low. "It's the digital trail Julian thought she'd buried under 3 layers of shell companies," Evelyn replied. "She's been siphoning the restoration funds for 18 months. It wasn't just greed, Elena. It was desperation. She's been covering her husband's gambling debts with the Vance heritage." The chime above the door rang, a bright, silver sound that felt like a warning. Elena turned to see a flash of designer silk. Julian stepped into the boutique, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She was flanked by Sarah Vance, who looked uncomfortable, clutching a designer handbag like a shield. Julian stopped dead when she saw Elena. Her face, perfectly contoured and frozen in a mask of porcelain beauty, twisted into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I thought I told the police to keep the trash off the streets," Julian said, her voice carrying easily to the 2 other socialites browsing the back of the store. She didn't look at Evelyn. She kept her eyes locked on Elena's modest, off-the-rack trench coat. "Evelyn, darling, you really should check your security. You wouldn't want a disgraced thief handling your inventory. People like Elena have a habit of making things disappear." The room went silent. One of the browsing women whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward Elena. The sting of the public accusation was sharp, a calculated blow meant to draw blood in front of witnesses. "I'm here on business, Julian," Elena said, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "Business?" Julian laughed, a shrill, entitled sound. "What business could you possibly have here? Selling your grandmother's silver? Oh, wait. You already sold your soul when you tried to frame me for your own incompetence. Arthur Vance has already signed the papers to have you removed from the Foundation's history books. By tomorrow, you won't even be a footnote." Julian stepped closer, the scent of her cloying, $500 perfume invading Elena's space. She leaned in, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for her sister's ears. "I'm going to watch you rot in a cell for what you said to me last night. I've already told the board you've been hallucinating. No one believes a ghost." Lena didn't flinch. She felt the cold weight of the USB drive in her pocket, the secret power that Julianne didn't know she possessed. She looked past her sister to the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. 48 hours, Julianne," Elena whispered back. "That's how long you have left to enjoy the view from the top." "You're delusional," Julianne snapped, turning to the shop owner. "Evelyn, pack up the Sapphire Suite. I need it for the board dinner tomorrow night. Charge it to the foundation account." "I'm afraid that account is under internal review, Julianne," Evelyn said, her tone professional but laced with a hidden edge. Julianne's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She gripped her purse so hard her knuckles turned white. "We'll see about that. Come, Sarah, the air in here is becoming stagnant." As the door slammed behind them, the silver chime echoed in the sudden quiet. Elena looked at Evelyn. The first move had been made. Julianne had doubled down on her lies, and in doing so, she had walked right into the trap. "The board dinner is tomorrow night at 8, Elena said, her eyes cold. "The gavel falls then," Evelyn nodded. "I'll have the rest of the documents ready by dawn. Make her pay, Elena, for all of us." Elena walked out into the gray afternoon. The countdown had begun. 24 hours, until the Vance family's carefully constructed lie shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The following afternoon, the air in Detective Miller's office tasted of stale coffee and old paper. Elena Vance sat across from the man who held the final piece of her father's crumbling legacy in a manila folder. Outside, the city hummed with the indifferent energy of a Tuesday, but inside this cramped room, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to be counting down to Julianne's inevitable collapse. Detective Miller slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a forensic handwriting analysis, the ink dark and definitive. He tapped a calloused finger against the bottom of the page where 2 signatures sat side by side. One was shaky, the hand of a man recovering from a stroke. The other was a fluid, practiced imitation. "The lab confirmed it an hour ago," he said, his voice a low gravel. "The signatures on the foundation transfer weren't written by Arthur Vance. They were traced, then signed by your sister. She didn't just move the money, Elena. She committed a felony to do it." Elena felt a cold, sharp thrill run through her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth, cool surface of the document. This was it. The weapon she had been searching for since the day she was cast out. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a guillotine. She thought of the years she had spent in the shadows, rebuilding her life from the ruins Julianne had created, while her sister draped herself in stolen silk and unearned prestige. "Keep the original in the precinct safe," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging in her veins. "I only need the certified copies for tonight. The board dinner is at 8. Miller nodded, his eyes reflecting a grim sort of respect. "You're sure about this? Once this goes public, there's no coming back for her. The Vance name will be dragged through the mud." "Julianne dragged the name through the mud the moment she turned our father's charity into her personal piggy bank," she replied. She stood up, the weight of the folder in her hand feeling like a shield. "I'm not destroying the family. I'm performing surgery to save what's left of it." As she stepped out into the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. The vibration felt like a warning. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I hope you're enjoying your little tantrum with the jeweler." Julianne's voice came through the line, sharp and dripping with condescension. "I've already spoken to the bank. The internal review was a minor clerical error. It's being cleared as we speak. You really should have stayed in the gutters where you belong, Elena. It's embarrassing to watch you try to play at high society." Elena stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, a small, icy smile touching her lips. She could almost see her sister, probably sitting in the sunroom of the estate, sipping tea while Sarah Vance polished her mother's silver in the background. "Is that what you think this is, Julianne? A game of dress-up? I think you're a desperate woman trying to claw back a life that was never yours," Julianne snapped. "Arthur is officially naming me the sole executor of the estate tonight at the dinner." After that, I'm filing a restraining order. You won't even be allowed to walk on the same side of the street as this house." "I'll see you at 8, Elena said simply, then hung up before her sister could utter another insult. 2 hours later, she pulled up to the Vance manor. The sprawling estate looked like a fortress of limestone and ivy, a monument to a reputation built on a foundation of lies. She had come to collect the last of her personal belongings, a small box of her mother's journals she had purposely left behind as an excuse to see the enemy's camp one last time before the siege. She found them in the grand foyer. The scent of expensive lilies was overwhelming, a cloying floral mask for the rot beneath. Julianne stood at the base of the marble staircase, wearing a gown that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. She was directing a server with the flick of a manicured wrist, her posture radiating the arrogance of a queen who believed her throne was untouchable. "Still here?" Julianne sneered, her eyes raking over Elena's modest, well-tailored suit. "I thought I told you the help uses the rear entrance. Or are you here to beg for an invitation to the dinner? I might let you watch from the kitchen if you promise not to steal the silverware." Sarah Vance stepped out from the dining room, her expression a mix of pity and practiced indifference. "Julianne, let it go. She's just here for her box." "She's here because she can't stand that I won," Julianne countered, stepping closer to Elena. She leaned in, her perfume a suffocating cloud of jasmine. "You were always the smart one, the architect, but look at you. You're a guest in your own childhood home, and by tomorrow, you'll be a stranger. I've spent 5 years making sure every board member, every judge, and every friend of our fathers thinks you're a thief. Who do you think they're going to believe? A disgraced exile, or the woman who stayed behind to care for a dying man?" Elena didn't flinch. She looked past her sister to the top of the stairs, where Arthur Vance stood, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked diminished, a ghost of the powerful judge he once was, his eyes clouded with a confusion that Julianne had carefully cultivated. "I'm not here to be believed, Julianne," Elena said, her voice loud enough to carry to the balcony. She reached into her bag and felt the crisp edge of the forensic report. "I'm here to be heard, and tonight the whole world is going to listen." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of her heels clicking like a metronome against the marble. Behind her, she heard Julianne's mocking laughter, a brittle, ugly sound that echoed through the hollow house. "Don't be late, Elena," Julianne called out. "I want you to have a front row seat when the judge signs the final papers. It's going to be the performance of a lifetime." Elena stepped out into the cooling evening air. She checked her watch, 6 o'clock. In 2 hours, the elite of the city would gather in that dining room. They would expect a celebration of legacy and loyalty. Instead, they were going to witness an execution. She climbed into her car, the folder resting on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. The countdown was over. The gavel was about to fall. The afternoon sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the Vance Estate Library, casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of leather-bound law books. It was less than 24 hours before the family's centennial gala, an event Julianne had spent months turning into a coronation for herself. Elena stood by the mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the cool, polished edge of a silver letter opener. The weight of it was grounding, a sharp contrast to the hollow ache that had lived in her chest since her exile began. The double doors swung open with a violent thud. Julianne Vance swept into the room, the sharp, rhythmic click of her designer stilettos echoing like gunfire against the parquet floor. She smelled of cloying jasmine and expensive gin, a scent that always preceded a storm. She didn't even look at her sister as she marched toward the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace that sat against her throat. Elena recognized that necklace. It was a St. James original, a piece their mother had intended for the eldest daughter. Julianne had claimed it the day after the funeral, whispering lies about a verbal amendment to the will that no one dared to question. "Still lurking in the corners, Elena?" Julianne asked, her reflection sneering in the glass. She fingered the diamonds with a possessive greed that made Elena's skin crawl. "I thought you'd have packed your bags by now. The gala starts in 20 hours. By the time the clock strikes midnight, the judge will have signed the final transfer of the estate. It's public, it's legal, and most importantly, it's mine. Elena turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the woman who shared her blood but none of her conscience. She felt the hidden weight of the forensic report in her bag, a document that proved Julianne hadn't just been greedy, she'd been criminal. She had diverted funds from Sarah Vance's trust and funneled them into offshore accounts to maintain this very lifestyle. I've spent a lot of time looking at the foundation of this house lately, Julianne, Elena said, her voice calm, a low vibration that seemed to settle in the quiet room. You should be careful. When you build on a lie, the collapse doesn't just take the roof, it takes everything. Julianne turned, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. She stepped closer, invading Elena's space until the scent of her perfume was suffocating. You've always been so dramatic. That's why Arthur doesn't listen to you anymore. You're a ghost, Elena, a penniless architect with a grudge. Tomorrow night, I'm going to stand in front of the city's elite and accept the keys to the Vance legacy. And you'll be lucky if I let you keep your old room in the servants' quarters. She reached out, her manicured nail flicking the lapel of Elena's modest wool coat. Is this what you're wearing to the execution of your inheritance? It's charmingly pathetic. It almost makes me feel sorry for you. Don't waste your pity, Elena replied, her eyes locked onto her sister's with a terrifying stillness. You might need it for yourself when the lights go up. I'd suggest you double-check the forensic audits one last time tonight, specifically the ones from the St. James acquisition. Julianne froze for a fraction of a second, the color in her cheeks deepening into a mottled red. Then, she threw her head back and laughed, a brittle, ugly sound that lacked any real mirth. Audits! I have the best legal team in the state, Elena. I've already been cleared. You're grasping at straws because you're drowning. She turned back to the mirror, dismissing her sister with a flick of her wrist. Now, get out. I have a speech to rehearse, and I can't have the help distracting me. Elena didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked toward the door, her hand resting briefly on the folder tucked into her satchel. She thought of Detective Miller, who was at that very moment cross-referencing the signatures on the trust documents. She thought of the look on Arthur's face when he finally saw the truth about his favorite daughter. As she reached the hallway, she glanced back one last time. Julianne was preening, admiring her stolen diamonds in the fading light, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath her was already beginning to crack. The stage was set. The witnesses were invited. Elena walked out into the cooling evening air, the countdown in her head ticking towards 0. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy wouldn't be transferred. It would be dismantled. The evening of the Oak Haven Gala arrived with a heavy, humid heat that seemed to trap the scent of overripe gardenias against the limestone walls of the Vance estate. Within the grand ballroom, the air was filtered and cool, humming with the polite vibration of a string quartet and the rhythmic clinking of crystal. Julianne Vance stood at the center of the room, a vision in shimmering champagne silk that perfectly matched the vintage diamonds dripping from her neck and ears. She held court with the effortless grace of a queen who had already won the war, her laughter ringing out like a silver bell whenever a board member offered a compliment. Arthur Vance stood beside his daughter, looking every bit the retired judge in his tailored tuxedo. His posture was stiff, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of pride and a lingering, unspoken exhaustion. He reached out to pat Julianne's hand, his expression softening. She leaned into him, the picture of filial devotion, while her eyes darted toward the entrance, searching for the one person she expected to see crawling back for a final plea. Elena Vance entered the ballroom precisely 10 minutes after the official start. She didn't arrive with the frantic energy of a woman defeated. Instead, she moved with a terrifying, silent composure. She wore a dress of midnight navy, simple and architectural, which stood out like a bruise against the sea of pastels and gold. She didn't look for her father first. She looked at the room, noting the positioning of the witnesses. Sarah Vance was near the buffet, looking uncomfortable in her finery, while several key investors from the restoration project were huddled near the bar. Julianne spotted her sister and immediately straightened, her smile sharpening into something predatory. She whispered something to Arthur before detaching herself from the group and gliding toward the entrance. She intercepted her sister near a towering floral arrangement that smelled cloyingly of lilies. "I'm surprised you showed up," Julianne said, her voice low enough to stay private, but loud enough to carry a sting. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric of the navy dress with a dismissive flick. "It's a bit somber for a celebration, don't you think? But I suppose it's fitting. You always were better at mourning than participating." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold condensation of the water glass she'd picked up from a passing tray, the chill grounding her. "I wouldn't miss tonight for anything. It's a significant milestone for the family." "It's the end of your era and the beginning of mine," Julianne countered, her eyes flashing with a cruel triumph. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive, musky perfume clashing with the gardenias. "I saw the look on your face yesterday. You're hollow. You have nothing left but that little folder of yours, and Dad won't even look at it. He's already signed the preliminary intent. By 10 o'clock tonight, Oak Haven and the Vance Restoration Fund will be under my sole direction." "You seem very certain of that," Elena replied. She reached into her small clutch, her fingers grazing the edge of the digital recorder and the heavy, embossed card Evelyn sent, James had given her. The weight of the evidence was a secret power, a silent weapon she was not yet ready to unsheath. "I am certain," Julianne sneered. She turned her head as a group of board members approached. "Oh, look, the Hamiltons are here. Try not to embarrass us by lingering too long near the important people. You look like a charity case in that dress." The insult was a sharp spike of rage, but Elena channeled it into a calm, steady focus. She watched her sister walk away, her champagne silk train sweeping the floor like a serpent's tail. Julianne was so blinded by her own light that she couldn't see the shadows closing in. Elena moved deeper into the room, catching the eye of Detective Miller, who stood near the terrace doors. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was unmistakable, a solid, immovable force in a room full of shifting loyalties. He gave her a singular, imperceptible nod. The signatures had been verified. The paper trail was complete. Arthur approached her then, his face a mask of conflicted duty. "Elena, I didn't think you'd come after our talk yesterday." "I had to be here, Dad," she said, her voice softening. "I wanted you to see the legacy clearly one last time before everything changes." Arthur sighed, his gaze drifting to Julianne, who was currently laughing with the head of the Historical Society. "She's worked hard for this. She's shown a dedication I didn't think she possessed. I know it's hard for you to lose the project, but the family name must come first." "The family name is exactly what I'm thinking about," she said. She saw Sarah watching them from across the room, her younger sister's face pale and drawn. Sarah knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to stop the momentum. The wait for it moment arrived when the master of ceremonies tapped a microphone, the sharp sound cutting through the music. The room began to settle, guests turning their chairs toward the small dais at the far end of the ballroom. Julianne took her place at the edge of the stage, her hand resting on the podium as if she already owned the wood it was carved from. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze landing on Elena with a look of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, stepping up to the microphone. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who believed he was doing the right thing for his bloodline. "Tonight, we celebrate the future of Oak Haven. We celebrate the transition of stewardship to a new generation." Elena felt the pulse in her neck, a steady rhythm of anticipation. She looked at Evelyn St. James, who had just entered the back of the room, her presence a silent herald of the truth. The jeweler's eyes met Elena's, and for a second the air in the room felt electric, charged with the impending collapse of 1,000 lies. Julianne stepped forward, her hand reaching for the folder Arthur held, the final documents that would seal the transfer. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with performative humility. "I am so honored to carry on the Vance name. To my sister, Elena, I wish you peace in your next chapter, wherever that may take you." She smiled, a victor's smile, and reached for the pen. "Wait," Elena said. The word wasn't a shout. It was a calm, cold command that sliced through the applause before it could even begin. The room went deathly silent. Every head turned. Julian's hand froze an inch above the paper, her face contorting into a mask of sudden, sharp irritation. "Elena, sit down," Arthur whispered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I think the guests should see the full history of the Restoration Fund first," Elena said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. She began to walk toward the stage, the midnight navy of her dress moving like a shadow across the white marble. Especially the parts Julianne forgot to include in her report. Julianne's grip on the podium tightened until her knuckles turned white. "This isn't the time for your jealousy, Elena. Security, please." "Security isn't here for me, Julianne," Elena said, stopping at the foot of the stairs. She looked up at her sister, her expression one of chilling clarity. "They're here for the person who's been selling the Vance diamonds to offshore accounts for the last 3 years. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Julianne's sharp, ragged intake of breath. The stage was set. The witnesses were watching, and the countdown had finally hit 0. Julianne Vance's fingers clawed at the edge of the mahogany podium, her knuckles straining against skin that had gone deathly pale. The massive LED screen behind her didn't flicker. It held the image of the Cayman Islands wire transfers with agonizing stability. Every guest in the ballroom could see the dates, the amounts, and the digital signature that Julianne had thought was untraceable. Elena Vance didn't move from her position at the foot of the stairs. She held the small black transmitter like a scepter. The scent of the thousands of white lilies decorating the hall suddenly felt cloying, like a funeral shroud. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the cooling fans in the AV rack and the frantic, shallow breathing coming from the woman on stage. Arthur Vance broke the silence first. He walked toward the stage, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with the finality of a gavel. He didn't look at the crowd or the cameras. He looked only at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the private family account numbers Julianne had used as her personal piggy bank. The betrayal written on his face was more cutting than any legal sentence. Beside him, Sarah Vance gasped, her hand clutching her pearl necklace so hard the string looked ready to snap. "Julianne," she whispered, the name sounding like a plea and a curse all at once. She took a step back, physically distancing herself from the daughter she had championed only moments ago. The socialites in the front row followed suit, a collective rustle of silk and sequins as the inner circle of the Vance empire withdrew, leaving Julianne isolated in the center of the stage. Julianne's face began to undergo a terrifying transformation. The calculated arrogance that had defined her for 30 years vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. Her eyes grew wide and bloodshot, darting from the exit to her father, finding no mercy in either. Her skin seemed to lose its elasticity, sagging into deep lines of terror that her expensive facials couldn't hide. Her mouth opened and closed, a pathetic, fish-like motion that produced nothing but a wet, clicking sound. The sweat was no longer a bead. It was a sheen that made her face glitter under the harsh stage lights, exposing the trembling of her chin and the frantic pulse drumming in her throat. She looked less like a wolf and more like a cornered rat, realizing the walls were made of steel. Detective Miller stepped into the light at the edge of the ballroom. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. He simply held up a pair of steel cuffs, the light catching the metal. The sight of them seemed to break the last of Julianne's composure. She slumped, her weight supported only by the podium she had used to belittle Elena for years. Elena finally ascended the stairs. She moved with a grace that Julianne had always claimed was beneath her. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the mascara running into the cracks of Julianne's crumbling mask. "You spent 10 years telling the world I was the stain on this family," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the absolute stillness of the hall, it carried to the very back row. "You said I didn't belong in this house, or in this name." Julianne tried to speak, a raspy "Elena, please," but the word died in her throat as Elena stepped closer. "You were right about one thing, Julianne," Elena continued, her eyes as cold and clear as the diamonds her sister had stolen. I don't belong in a family that harbors people like you. And as of 5 minutes ago, neither do you. The board has already seen the full file. You're not just a Vance anymore. You're a defendant. Elena didn't wait for a response. She didn't stay to watch the police close the distance. She turned her back on the stage and walked down the center aisle. She felt the weight of a decade of exile falling away with every step she took on the white marble. She didn't look back when she heard the first sob break from the stage, or when the crowd finally erupted into a roar of scandalized whispers. She walked straight through the heavy oak doors and into the cool, night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance legacy behind her. The silence in the grand ballroom was a physical weight, heavier than the crystal chandeliers overhead. Seconds after Elena vanished through the oak doors, the vacuum she left behind was filled by the sharp, rhythmic click of Detective Miller's boots against the polished floor. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The evidence flickering on the massive screen behind the stage had already done the work of 1,000 handcuffs. Julianne Vance stood frozen at the podium, the microphone still live, catching the ragged, uneven sound of her breathing. Her face didn't just pale, it seemed to structurally fail. The carefully applied porcelain foundation cracked around the corners of her mouth, which hung open in a jagged, silent O. Her eyes, usually sharp with calculated malice, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. The vibrant flush of her earlier triumph had been replaced by a sickly, grayish hue that made her look decades older in the harsh glow of the projector. Her chest heaved against the silk of her designer gown, the fabric straining as her posture collapsed, her shoulders hunching forward as if she could physically shrink away from the judgment of the room. "It's a lie," she finally gasped, the sound amplified and distorted by the speakers. She looked toward the front row, her hands trembling so violently that she had to grip the edge of the mahogany stand. "Father, tell them, Elena is unstable. She's always been jealous. She forged those documents." Arthur Vance did not look up. The retired judge sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped over the silver head of his cane. The man who had spent a lifetime demanding the truth looked as though he had been turned to stone by it. Beside him, Sarah Vance pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, physically leaning away from the stage as if Julian's disgrace were a contagious fever. "The bank confirmed the routing numbers 10 minutes ago, Julianne," Detective Miller said, his voice echoing with a flat, professional finality. He reached the base of the stairs, the metallic jingle of the cuffs at his belt cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "The signature on the offshore transfer isn't Elena's. We have the forensic audit. It's over." The flip was instantaneous and brutal. The same socialites who had toasted Julian's visionary leadership moments ago now recoiled. Mrs. Gable, who had been whispering praise in Julian's ear all evening, pointedly turned her back, shielding her daughter from the sight of the stage. The board members scrambled to the edges of the room, their faces masks of corporate self-preservation, already distancing themselves from the sinking ship of the Vance legacy. In the midst of the rising chaos, Evelyn St. James sat perfectly still in her velvet-backed chair. The elderly jeweler looked frail, her skin the color of aged parchment, but her eyes were fixed on the stage with a strange, luminous peace. She had spent a decade holding the secrets that had finally set Elena free. As the police officers ascended the stage, she let out a long, shuddering sigh. Her hand moved slowly to her chest, clutching the modest pearl pendant she always wore, the one Julianne had mocked for being sentimental trash. "She did it," the old woman whispered, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips. "The truth finally came home." A sudden gasp erupted from the front row. Sarah turned just in time to see the jeweler's head loll back against the velvet. The light in those sharp, knowing eyes flickered and went out, extinguished by the very moment of justice she had lived to witness. "Evelyn!" Sarah cried out, reaching for her, but the jeweler was gone. The stress of the decade, the weight of the evidence, and the final, explosive catharsis had been more than her tired heart could sustain. She died in the center of the room she had conquered, surrounded by the diamonds she had protected. The irony was a bitter tang in the air. Julianne didn't even notice. She was too busy screaming as the officers took her arms. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? I am a Vance. You can't do this to me." "You're not a Vance anymore," Arthur said, finally standing. His voice was cracked, the authority of the bench replaced by the hollow grief of a father who had realized he'd raised a monster. He didn't look at his daughter as they led her down the stairs. He looked at the empty space where Elena had stood. "You're just a thief." Julianne was paraded through the center aisle, the same path Elena had taken in quiet dignity. But where Elena had left a trail of stunned admiration, Julianne left only the scent of scorched earth and expensive perfume. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, faces twisted in disgust. One of the board members, a man Julianne had once bullied into a bad land deal, stepped forward and spat a single word at her as she passed. "Fraud." Outside, the cool night air was thick with the smell of damp pavement and the low hum of idling police cruisers. Elena stood by the fountain, her back to the building. She didn't need to see the arrest to feel the shift in the world. She felt the heavy, suffocating mantle of her family's expectations finally dissolve. Detective Miller emerged from the doors, his expression grim. He walked toward her, pausing a few feet away. "She's in custody, Elena, but there's something else." Elena turned, her eyes searching his. The victory felt hollower than she had expected, a cold ache beginning to bloom in her chest. "What is it?" "It's Evelyn," Miller said softly. "She's gone. She didn't suffer, but she didn't make it to the end of the night." Elena's knees buckled, her hand catching the edge of the stone fountain. The water splashed cold against her skin, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in her throat. She looked up at the grand, lit-up windows of the ballroom, the place that had just been the site of her greatest triumph and her most devastating loss. The cost of her innocence had been higher than she ever imagined. She was free, but the woman who had been her only mother in the dark years was gone, leaving Elena alone with a legacy she no longer wanted and a future she hadn't yet learned how to build. She reached into her evening bag and pulled out the small, velvet box Evelyn had given her before the gala. Inside was a simple gold key. There was no note, no explanation, just the key and a sense of a final, unopened door. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the St. James estate had closed behind Elena Vance for the last time. The scandal that followed the gala had been a slow-motion car crash, one that the high society of the city couldn't stop rewinding. Elena didn't stay to watch the wreckage. Instead, she retreated into the one thing that had never betrayed her, the architecture of the past. She stood now on the mezzanine of the newly restored Heritage Library, the scent of fresh sawdust and beeswax polish filling her lungs. It was a grounding, honest smell. Sunlight poured through the clear-story windows she had fought the board to preserve, casting long, golden rectangles across the marble floor. She wasn't wearing the borrowed silk of a victim or the heavy diamonds of a socialite. She wore a charcoal blazer and boots that had seen their fair share of construction sites. She looked like exactly what she was, the lead architect of her own life. A heavy footfall echoed on the stone below. She didn't need to look down to know who it was. Detective Miller leaned against a fluted column, his trench coat looking out of place in the pristine hall. He waited until she descended the spiral staircase before offering a brief, respectful nod. "The place looks good, Elena," Miller said. His voice was a low rumble in the vast space. "Evelyn would have liked the light." "She always said the truth needs a clear window to shine through," Elena replied, her fingers instinctively reaching for the gold key she now wore on a chain beneath her shirt. The key hadn't opened a vault of gold or a box of jewels. It had opened a small, climate-controlled archive in the basement of the St. James Gallery, a collection of every piece of evidence Evelyn had gathered over 20 years, documenting the Vance family's systematic exploitation of local artisans. "I thought you should know," Miller continued, his expression softening. "The final auction for the Vance Manor concluded this morning. The bank took everything, the cars, the art, even the silver." Elena felt a sharp, cold spike of something that wasn't quite joy, but a grim sort of justice. And Julianne. She's in a studio apartment over a dry cleaner's in East End, Miller said. I hear she tried to sue the moving company for scuffing a trunk she couldn't even afford to keep. The judge dismissed it in 5 minutes. She's working as a junior clerk for a probate lawyer now. From what I hear, she spends most of her lunch breaks calling people who used to be her friends. No one picks up. Elena pictured Julianne Vance, the woman who once poured wine over her dress with the casual cruelty of a bored queen, now sitting in a cramped, humid room, staring at a phone that refused to ring. The image should have been more satisfying, but it just felt heavy. Julianne had traded her soul for a crown made of glass, and now she was left bleeding from the shards. And my father? Elena asked. Arthur Vance is quiet, Miller said. He's moved into a veteran's retirement home. He refused the money you tried to send. I think the shame is doing more work than any prison sentence could. Elena nodded slowly. She had offered her father a way out, a small cottage on the coast, but he had looked at her with eyes that finally saw the daughter he had abandoned, and he had simply turned away. It was the only honest thing he had done in a decade. Miller tipped his hat and began to walk toward the exit. You did a good thing here, Elena. This building will be here long after the gossip dies. When he was gone, the library returned to its hallowed silence. Elena walked to the center of the room, where a small bronze plaque had been mounted near the entrance. It bore no long-winded dedication, just a name: the Evelyn St. James Memorial Wing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope she had received that morning. It was from Julianne. The handwriting was still loopy and arrogant, demanding that Elena stop this nonsense and restore her credit lines before she told the papers the real story. It was a desperate, toothless threat from a woman who still didn't realize the world had moved on without her. Elena didn't feel rage anymore. She felt a profound, echoing pity. She walked to the small fireplace in the reading nook, struck a match, and watched the paper curl into black ash. The entitlement that had once been a cage was now just a pile of soot. The cost of her freedom had been high. She had lost the woman who was a mother to her, and she had lost the illusion of a family she had spent her youth trying to please. She was the last Vance standing, and the name no longer meant power, it meant survival. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. The sun was setting, painting the skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold. Elena Vance turned away from the glass, picked up her blueprints, and walked into the quiet, steady light of her own future. She didn't look back at the shadows. She had built something that could finally hold the weight of her heart.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.